Hi, this is Will Frazier with Opinions of Value. Business valuations for divorce purposes often involve the subject of goodwill. Now, goodwill, especially when it relates to personal goodwill and the differentiation with company or enterprise goodwill, can become a complicated and somewhat murky topic. Now, if we're valuing a single member personal service business, understanding what personal goodwill is may not be that complicated. But when we're valuing a manufacturing company or a distribution company or a larger service business, an operating company, well, then the subject gets more difficult. Differentiating between personal goodwill and company goodwill or enterprise goodwill begins to get a little more nuanced as the company gets larger and more complicated. It's safe to say that in larger companies, more complicated companies, that goodwill of the founders naturally or organically transfers to the younger members of the management team as they grow in their responsibilities and in their level of contacts with customers and suppliers. Take a look at this video PowerPoint as it describes goodwill as it is found in the company's financial statements.
Goodwill. Well, what is goodwill? Goodwill is defined as enterprise value, or the value of 100% of the assets of the company, the value of the company, minus the fair market value of total tangible assets. Now notice I said fair market value. For other types of valuation purposes, for example, you see the asterisk here, for financial reporting valuation purposes, for example, fair value is used, and that's why those terms are not interchangeable between valuations for divorce purposes and valuations for financial reporting purposes. Now, enterprise value, what is that? That's the fair market value. Again, we're talking about for family law purposes, the fair market value of the company, which also can be defined as the fair market value of 100% of the equity of the company plus the fair market value of long-term debt. Now, goodwill is used in at least 3 other business valuation contexts: financial reporting purposes, merger and acquisition transactions, and family law. The terminology in all these 3 types are similar, but there are important differences. And so the usages and terminology are not interchangeable. So we have a company here, Acme Distributing Company. The fair market value of Acme Distributing Company is the fair market value of 100% of its assets. Now, as we discussed earlier, the definition of goodwill is the value of the company minus its total tangible assets. So what are total tangible assets? Well, current assets such as accounts receivable, cash, and inventory. And then property, plant, and equipment, the fixed assets of the company. Now, you will note that if you look at the company's balance sheet, this will say net property, plant, and equipment. That's because on the company's financial statements, property, plant, and equipment is recorded on a cost basis, and that basis is changed annually based upon depreciation. So that depreciation expense is netted against the original cost basis of these assets, and that's why at the bottom of the section talking about property, plant, and equipment, you'll see a total which says net property, plant, and equipment. We're not concerned with that here. We're concerned with the fair market value of these assets in the marketplace. So the sum of the fair market value, and current assets can have values other than book value as well. So total tangible assets for goodwill purposes is the fair market value of current assets and property, plant, and equipment. So now we get to goodwill. So here we have the total tangible assets. We have the total assets of the company. The difference is goodwill. Goodwill is an intangible asset. So there are components of goodwill. There's basically 2 different categories, and within each category there are different components. The first category is something we call enterprise goodwill. That's the goodwill that is owned by the company. And then secondly, we have personal goodwill. That's the goodwill that is owned, that is associated with an individual, the contribution that individual makes to the value of the company. And then when we say value of the company here, we're using that in sort of broad terms. The value of the organization. What would a buyer pay for this collection of assets, including this personal goodwill? And usually the way a buyer would capture this would be through an employment contract and or non-competition agreement. And I have a few slides in here on how the financial reporting valuation terminology is different. We're not going to go into that, but this slide deck will be on my website at some point in time, and you're free to download it and look at it at your leisure. Okay, goodwill components, the enterprise goodwill. These intangible assets are such things as the workforce, the assembled workforce, the trade name, trademarks, customer relationships or customer lists, production backlog, agreements such as licensing or royalty agreements, franchise agreements, employment contracts, and non-competition agreement or agreements. Personal goodwill. Now that has to do with the situation where the reputation of the key person and the company are intertwined. It's such that the reputation of the company is dependent upon the reputation of the individual. They're thought of together. And it's also a situation where the key relationships reside with that key person, and the relationships could be with customers, suppliers, and employees, such that if that person were to leave the business, a certain number or perhaps all of the employees might follow them. So that's always those are always facts that need to be considered in the valuation process. So the value of personal goodwill, the way it's determined, it's the value of the business minus the value of the business without the key person. So one question is, do we assume that that key person will be in competition with the company when we're calculating the value of the business without the key person? The answer to that is maybe. This is a facts and circumstances determination.
Well, this is Will Frazier, and I hope my opinions have been of value to you. And we'd like to wish you a happy Thanksgiving.